Porta dell'Arme, the Bolognese podcast where we discuss the intricacies of the Bolognese tradition. Today's guest is Jürg Gassmann.
Hi, our guest today is Jürg Gassmann. Hi, Jürg. Thanks for joining us on the podcast here at Art of Arms.
Yeah, welcome.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
It's our pleasure. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your martial arts background and how you got involved in Western martial arts.
Well, we've lived a bit all over the place, and in 2007 we moved to Switzerland. We have two sons, Jack and Sam, who you're probably familiar with, and they were very interested in fencing. And so when we moved to Switzerland, we first signed up for Olympic fencing. That is, I signed up the kids, and we had this long talk. This is going to be very serious. We're not just going to go there and then drop it after a few weeks. So no, okay. We started that, and the instructor there was so incredibly nasty. I mean, it was surprising and gratuitously nasty.
Even by Swiss standards?
She wasn't Swiss, but no, I wrote to the president of the club and said, look, she was nasty to me at one point, for no good reason. And I wrote it and said, look, I'm not subjecting my children to this. Either this changes or we leave. And then there was a very dramatic event. She allowed Jack to join in sort of fun sparring. And Jack committed the unpardonable sin of beating her favorite in this sparring. And she complained to me
What was he thinking, man?
She complained to me that Jack was being too aggressive. I mean, this is a martial art, right? So we left. But they were still interested. And so Jack came up with this brilliant plan of going to a LARP camp somewhere in Germany, and I said, no, there's no way I'm doing this. Look, this is a 1 week camp in Germany. We don't have a proper tent. We have basically a pup tent. If it ends up raining, there's no way we'll survive that. And this is LARP. The fun is about sitting around the fireplace after everything is done and drinking, and you're too young to drink, and these guys I could be their father, so no, this is not going to work. And so then my wife found Arts of Mars, the Colin Richards event, and that looked interesting, and so I signed us up. And I called Colin and I said, hi, Colin, we're interested in coming to your event. What do we need to bring? And he said, oh, don't worry about it. Just, everything is provided. So we showed up. Of course, nothing was provided. But one thing that was immediately great was, we showed up for these tutorials and workshops, and immediately everybody was sharing. Saying, you guys are doing a workshop where you don't need your masks. I'm gonna share your masks over here, and so it was just a great atmosphere. And so after that experience, we didn't look back, and then we signed up for Dijon the next spring, and then went to Vienna at one point. there was a new startup airline from our local airport, tiny little airport. The only flight they had was to Vienna, and they had a special where if the adult bought a ticket, then all kids travel free. And so,
well, that's fantastic.
Yeah, that's great.
That'll sell a lot of tickets.
So we went to different events and never looked back. I mean, obviously Jack and Sam are much more proficient in it than I am, but that's how we got into the field. And I then saw that part of HEMA was also the research, and that's where I got more involved. But I did have the satisfaction at one Arts of Mars that I was sparring against Sam, and I could say, "Sam, I'm your father."
Did you cut off his hands?
That's awesome.
That's fantastic. So a lot of it, then, you're saying is it was the culture of Western martial arts that drew you to it, especially in comparison to the culture of traditional Olympic fencing?
Yeah, I mean, this was this one club in St. Gallen. I don't want to say that this is an aspect of the sport. It was just this club, but certainly for HEMA, I would say it was the culture, and bear in mind. When we started, Jack was 15 and Sam was 12, and and Sam took it very seriously, and he got a lot of respect for taking it seriously. Obviously he couldn't do everything, and he couldn't, wrestling against somebody like Lopez is a bit of an uneven contest, but they all. None of the people we interacted with at that point were sort of the attitude, "Oh, I have to prove that I can beat this little kid." Right? And what was very attractive, and I think important, was this ability to mingle with a very diverse age group.
Right.
I mean, that's fairly typical for sports in Switzerland, that sport is not something that is school focused, but it is community focused. So in a sports club, you really have all ages, and just this interaction provides a lot of mentoring. And initially, obviously, I had to be there, but as soon as they were 16, and again, public transport in Europe is so reliable, they could go to events on their own, and I didn't have to go with them, though I still enjoyed going and did so.
So
that's awesome.
You were talking about how you were drawn to the research. One of the things that I stumbled across years ago was a paper you wrote on the armed societies of Bologna.
Right, yes.
Yeah, so can you tell us a bit about those armed societies? What were they?
Sure, I mean, this is the first paper I wrote, right? Just by way of background, that was my first piece of research after leaving university. And the way it came about is there was this collection of these bylaws of these armed societies that Pim Terminiello had found, and they were all in Latin. So the question was, what does it say? Are these fencing clubs? What are they? And through Jean Chandler, it came to me and said, "Oh, I'm happy to look at them and see what it says." I could very quickly say that, well, this has unfortunately nothing to do with fencing societies. They are bylaws of civic organizations from the city of Bologna from the mid-13th century. And, on one hand it was disappointing because it had practically nothing to do with HEMA. But it historically was very interesting for a variety of reasons, and I'm happy to go into those.
Yeah. What was interesting about them?
Well, most of these, this collection, most of these bylaws were from a very specific date, and that was the 1250s. And in 1256, the city of Bologna purchased all serfs and slaves and freed them.
Mm-hmm.
And the laws of Bologna required any bylaws of a civic society to be submitted to the government of the town for review and approval. And most of the bylaws in this collection were from around that time. And they all were very similar in their basic content. Some were very long text, some were quite short, just 2-3 pages. But the basic drift was the same. And the view that I formed was that the city of Bologna was very worried about just freeing these people who had no attachments. They probably had no family, at least no extended family. They had no established history in the city. And these societies were one of the means by which these newly freed individuals were bound into the civic structures of the city.
So the freed serfs and the freed slaves had joined these armed societies?
Yes.
Wow.
I think that's... there are several provisions where it is suggested that was the intent. Mm-hmm. On one hand, there is a provision that there's several that they have to elect committee with different responsibilities as committee members, and there are provisions which say that if you have to make sure that at least some of the committee members are literate. Right? So you don't require everybody to be literate, but you have to have enough individuals on the committee for the committee to keep minutes and to do the written correspondence. The second thing is that, especially later then, there's the introduction of rules saying who is undesirable as a member of the society. And there is certainly no provision saying somebody who was a slave or is descended from a slave is unacceptable to the society. The circle of the unacceptable members is very different than that.
So, Jürg, are these mostly from bylaws that we see with some of the sort of extra Bolognese armed societies where we have like the Tasci and the Lombardi and the Stella in particular? Or were these sort of freed slaves and people of these lower classes that were kind of being integrated into this society also coming from like the districts particularly? Did you see any evidence of that through your research?
A bit difficult to answer. Most of the societies were based on districts demarcated by roads, and you see this in the in the bylaws themselves, there's one or two provisions saying members of society can be people who live to the west of this road, to the east of that road, and then on the other side of the gate, which is sort of demarcated, or where this
So they were neighborhood
sector ends. So then there's the Society of the Tuscans and the Lombards. The membership there is probably decided by the Tuscans, the Florentines, and then the Lombards, the Milanese, and cities under that control. So those are probably not, or those are not defined by sort of residential district, but really where do you come from? And then there's one third category, and there's only one of those. That's the Beccai or Beccari. That does the butchers, and there the bylaws sort of double as guild bylaws. Now, these armed societies are not guilds; they are civic societies. I mean, in a medieval society, you had lots and lots of these associations. You had professional associations like the guilds. You had sodalities, which were more religious-oriented societies. So an individual would have been a member of more than one society for a variety of reasons, and the societies really gave structure and protection and identity to the medieval individuals.
So before oh, go ahead.
Go on.
Sorry. Oh, I was gonna say, before diving deeper into the societies, I wonder if we could just back it up for a second. Can you speak at all to what prompted the Bolognese to free the serfs and the slaves at great expense to the city?
Well, one thing that is evident is that Bologna in the first half of the 13th century was expanding rapidly economically, and they had a lack of manpower, and the economies of these Italian towns were very much focused on small-scale manufacturing.
Right.
Not quite industrial scale yet, but large workshops with a structure of masters, apprentices, journeymen, providing value-added processing of
so like an advanced pre-industrial manufacturing process.
Yes. Okay. And many of the serfs and slaves were really domestic or agricultural laborers in the upper class, especially nobility households. And I think this was a way of commercial, putting the population of Bologna on a more commercial basis.
Got it. So they were sort of an underutilized labor resource as serfs and slaves, and they kind of took them out of that and then put them into a place where they could more fully utilize their labor as industrial workers.
Yeah, and where they became taxpayers and also soldiers.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I mean, you had the defense of these North Italian towns relied on a city militia,
right?
And of course, as a slave, you couldn't be, and they didn't want you in the militia. But as a free individual, you were obliged to be part of the militia. You were obliged to purchase a certain complement of arms and be available. And as you say, underutilized manpower. Yes, I think so.
Yeah.
An entrepreneurial individual works a lot harder than a slave.
Yeah, for sure. And it seems like, not only would the motivation be there to work harder, but also to fight for the city that gave them their liberty and their freedom. To me, that's I mean, if I'm building an army and it's an army of freed slaves, I think I've got a pretty good army on my hands, because what they're fighting for is something, truly unique and special.
Yeah.
Right. They've got a stake in the game. So we could say, maybe it's a slight exaggeration to say that the modern world began in Bologna in 1256.
Well, it is.
I mean, I think it's important for people to realize at this time, Bologna was one of the sixth largest cities in the European continent. It was huge. It was absolutely massive before the 1350s plague or 1347 plague. So it's a place of...
Yeah. All of the North Italian cities were extremely dynamic in culturally, economically, finance, the invention of or introduction of pretty modern forms of finance to develop long-distance trade, shipping.
Right.
A lot going on in different cities. Experimented with different specialties and developed different strengths and tools. So, there was also a religious element to it, in that the church sort of disapproved of the practice, and I hesitate that was the prime mover, but I think it added a further impetus to doing it.
Got it. Okay. So now we were kind of speaking about the importance of militias to the defense of northern Italian city-states. Did the armed societies have a role in the militias?
I think that is very clear that they did. The rules or the bylaws of the armed societies require every member to have certain arms. Now, the ones that are listed in the armed society bylaws are all defensive arms. So you had to have a shield, you had to have some kind of head protection. Again, vocabulary is very varied, and you had to have some kind of upper body protection, what they call a guaiferia, which is the only place this word has ever been used. No idea what it actually means. I think it probably means a gambeson of some sort.
Interesting.
And there is the occasional mention of a spear or something like that. Again, interesting vocabulary, not quite clear what it means. But all of the arms listed or required to be held are defensive arms. We can speculate on why that was so. One reason could be that offensive arms everybody naturally has,
right?
But
The logical conclusion.
Yeah.
Yeah, but as you know, if you've ever worked with health and safety, it's easy to get people to use a drill or a hammer, but you really have to be on them to use protective gloves and steel cap toe shoes and things like that. Protective arms, you have to be protective equipment is heavy, it's cumbersome, it slows you down, so you actually have to be after people to use it. Another aspect is that you had to have the devices, a distinctive device of the society on your protective arms, and it's easy to imagine you having a picture of whatever the device was, the symbol of your society was, on your shield or on your gambeson. It's more difficult to imagine it on your spear because just there is nothing else to put it.
Yeah, I wonder how they went about doing that. Engraving on the wall, I guess? Yeah.
But this is
painted.
very distinctive. This is throughout all the bylaws that they have this requirement for defensive arms, and they have the requirement to put the device on your defensive arms. You're not allowed to sell them, you're not allowed to mortgage them, you're not allowed to lend them to anybody. You must always have them in your own possession.
Okay. Oh, maybe the offensive weapons were primarily kept with the city then.
I was wondering about that. I didn't see any indication for that, and certainly in the general history of 13th century Italy, it would not have been typical for the citizenry to be disarmed and the arms to be kept in, let's say, an arsenal or something like that. Later on, you had, let's say, heavy weapons like the artillery or things like crossbows, and so those were kept at an arsenal and given out to the citizenry. But spears, swords, those you would have been expected
around the house
to have in your own possession.
Yeah, if I remember, I think there were some carry laws at the time. I remember vaguely reading this in the Violence and Justice in medieval Bologna. But I think in 1250, there were some restrictions around what weapons could be carried. Obviously, like from our conversation with Aaron, we kind of cornered that as, specifically carried. But one of the weapons that I thought was really interesting and that they permitted to be carried were actually two-handed swords, because it was like a symbol of like knightly virtue. And so you couldn't carry a single-handed sword because it could be a peasant's weapon or just a common weapon, if you will. But a two-handed sword you could keep on your person throughout the city when other weapons were banned, or at least like physically carrying were banned, which is super interesting.
I mean, there's a difference between having it at home and carrying it around town in daily commerce, where you want to minimize
random violence.
Acts, yes.
Yes.
It may also not have been as dangerous of a weapon. So far in going through the Condottieri Ventura's database on the use of, when they talk about the two-handed sword, every guy with a two-handed sword gets his ass kicked by somebody else. They look cool and they're exciting, but basically every time they run up against a guy with a spear or with a shield, they're like, oh, never mind, it's useless. That weapon's useless.
Yeah. That's
awesome.
fascinating.
So speaking of utility, so were these armed societies any good at fighting?
Again, the conclusion I came to is that, let me go at it in a different way. The fighting force of the city was under the control of the city authorities.
Right.
There was a capitanius who would raise the troops and organize them. And I didn't find in the bylaws any provisions regarding say small unit organization where you'd say you form platoons of 25.
Right.
That was sort of the typical size for an infantry unit, 25, 20 quina. So it became clear to me that the military organization of the militia was a matter for the city authorities, not for the armed societies. But I would think that just military logic would suggest that when the city authorities form the units, that they take into account the membership of the societies, and you don't mix them up. You take advantage of the fact that these guys know each other, and they have a vested interest in protecting each other and working with each other.
So is it kind of safe to assume that, based on what you're saying, that the city still used the structure of the tribu or the cortiero, where they would kind of use the four quarters or the four districts of Bologna to kind of, those were the banners that these armed societies would kind of rally to, and that perhaps these armed societies were meant more for developing small unit tactics that would have fed into like the larger unit tactics of the quarters, or that they were just doing, they might have perhaps been doing some sort of like training or weapons sort of development or.
Again, there is nothing on training.
Yeah.
There is nothing on use of weapons. There is, and also if we look at the structure of the committees, now they have a banner bearer, gonfaloniere. That they do have. But the committee of the society is elected every 6 months. So you have no continuity, and there are rules about being re-elected. So there's not the assumption that somebody can get re-elected again and again and again. No, once you've been elected, you're not eligible again for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, depending on the bylaws, if they regulate it at all. So they must have been quite keen to ensure that these armed societies didn't develop, I would say, an active agency.
Right.
They didn't develop a leader who could use the armed society for his own ends. To me, these armed societies were very much an effort to ensure that they did not get involved in politics. One of the key features of political life in 13th century Italian cities was the tension between the nobility and the popolo, especially popolo grasso. And pretty much all the bylaws have a rule saying that if there is commotion in the city, the armed society must assemble, must rally around their banner bearer, but must not do anything. They must just... No, the banner bearer has a specific place he goes to. Everybody rallies around him. The banner bearer is not allowed to move from that place unless he is told to do so by a certain set of individuals who are not the committee, but they're the anziani. They're the ones who are the liaison between the armed societies and the civilian city government.
Okay.
So, to me, this is a clear effort to make sure that these armed individuals, in case there is feuding between noble families or between a noble family and, let's say, one of the coup attempts or the innumerable coup attempts in cities, that this armed populace is neutralized, and that the violence does not escalate, that the violence is confined entirely to the belligerents, as you would say, and in that sense contained. And that if it seeks to go outside of that narrow population, that there are armed individuals who can, let's say, keep a lid on an escalating violence because they have an interest in doing so.
And we kind of see that with the Lambertazzi coup when that happens, and then the dissolution of the various guilds associated or armed societies associated with that, where they lose their right to continue to form.
Right, that was a huge controversy in early Bologna. I think almost half the city left with the Lambertazzi expulsion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that you can really see a failure of politics in that respect. That I mean, I'm comparing it to let's say cities in Switzerland north of the Alps. We also had city resident nobility, and there were also tensions between the burghers and the city resident nobility. But we found ways of resolving those. Whereas the Italian cities never did.
Well, they had ways
their
of resolving it,
solution-
but just tended to involve a lot of blood.
Well,
Yes.
but they also tried to push the nobility out of the city, and they didn't manage to integrate nobility and burghers into a cooperative way of managing the city, and I think that is what ultimately doomed these Republican constitutions, that they were not able to find this this integrative politics. So and so you had lots of noble families who were banned from the cities, and they then became a floating constituency of knights for hire, which, you know, in the internal and between city wars and fights, were available as expert fighters for hire.
Right. And bandits in peace and soldiers in war.
Yeah.
Yeah, yes, and you had the Ghibelline Guelph conflict where they were constantly fighting against each other, and then once that was over, they had the White Guelphs and the Black Guelphs, where they continued fighting each other. So, there was no political solution to these tensions, and I think there was a certain, I read it as a paranoia of the Popolo Grasso, that they couldn't really come to a resolution.
So it's a bit like the tensions in Republican Rome, right? How eventually, there basically came the two parties, I think the Optimates and the Populares, the same kind of thing. And then eventually the only resolution was to get a dictator that represented the Populares, and then that just turned into a continual dictatorship. Does that seem roughly the same thing?
Yeah, I think the in the Italian city-states, the time frames were much shorter. It was all just years, and no, I mean, you didn't have sort of Marius and Sulla and the big confrontations and the proscriptions and things like that. It was all on a much larger scale, and it changed so rapidly. And eventually they exhausted themselves, and all these Republican constitutions then devolved into signorias. So you had the princes, right? That became the rulers of the cities, and lost the Republican constitutions.
I think there's a lot of the modern research around this kind of actually pinpoints the notorial class, so the lawyer class that kind of came up, where a lot of like even the armed societies and things like that were, because of like the organizational structure, were required to have some sort of a notary assigned to like an armed society, or even the guilds had their own notary. And these guys became the liaisons to the Anziani, and a lot of times represented them in the Anziani. And then it created this oligarchy, basically, where you had this very special class of people that were these lawyers that were representatives of the guilds, and basically almost like a bureaucratic class, if you will, right? Like modern lobbyists in the United States, and how much power a lot of the corporations get based on like the success of their lobbyists and their lobbying efforts. So you had this development of bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy just devolved into, aligning various bureaucrats and the power that they could wield through their influence through smaller actions. And then you would have these big conglomerates come up and basically just wipe out a republican government and set up an oligarchy. So.
Yeah, and Bologna, of course, was also home to the university.
Right.
Right. The first non-ecclesiastical university, where the primary discipline was law, Roman law. And as you say with the notai, this is all of these bylaws were drafted by notaries. They're then their signatures, or the explicit says who wrote it, and it's always a notary. It also means that they're written in very nice Latin. The Latin is, it's post-classical, but it's good Latin. It's not Cicero, but it's
understandable.
it's not simplistic.
Yeah.
No, it is easily readable. It is. It's not. I mean, there is. Later, I think it's a Lombardy redaction of the bylaws from the late 15th century, and I started reading the first page, and it was pretty good Latin, and then it started to evolve. I mean, it's a really hilarious mishmash of of Latin, vulgarized Latin and Italian. I mean, it's really quite funny to read. But you had already beginning Italian in the late 13th, especially in the 14th century. Dante and the Decameron, all written in Latin, in Italian, not in Latin. So it didn't have to be in Latin, but it was in Latin. It was in very good Latin, and you can see also not just in Bologna, in other cities, city bylaws and official documents, they're written in Latin, even though there was at the same time a vernacular literary tradition already.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, I don't think we really see that kind of vernacular shift until the beginning of the, late 15th, early 16th century, when you have all the hippies come out and say, hey, we want to start writing in Latin like Aquilini.
Like Mancellino. Aquilini,
yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and Aquilini, yeah.
So if we can get back to the armed societies for a sec here, before we get on to language again, why would somebody join one of these armed societies? What would they get out of it?
Well, in a medieval society, it is really being member of a society that gives you protection and identity. And I think that was certainly a very important part of it. There doesn't seem to have been an obligation to join a society, and certainly it was not welcomed to be a member of more than one society. So if you were a member of one of the societies, that was your armed society. You get together, there is mutual protection, and especially if they're indigent, the bylaws talk a lot about what happens if one of the members dies. You pallbearers, you assist the family. There is some provisions about supporting indigents. In one of the bylaws, there's a provision if one of the members of the society is captured in war and is held for ransom and his family can't pay, that the society pays his ransom. There's also provisions about mediating disputes among members of society. They certainly wanted to be sure that you didn't, that there was no fighting in the societies. Usually got together at least once a month. all these societies are based in a church. So after the church service, there would be a meeting of the society where you then introduce new members, elect on certain days you perform the elections and stuff like that. There'd be once a year there'd be a communal meal. That's part of it. I would think also that there was, going back to the military side of it, certainly the the military leadership of the town also would have liked to see people be member of the society, because then they could rely on them having a certain complement of defensive arms and belonging to a group of people who knew each other and could be formed into a military unit under the command of an officer provided by the town. And plus, any one of these societies is a school in politics, because you have elections, right? You have a committee. Somebody who has political ambitions can practice these skills within a smaller setting where everybody is known. How do you canvass for elections? How do you run, when you're a member of the committee, how do you run an organization like this society? And as you develop the political skills for doing civic offices that are then more important and also more lucrative.
Okay, cool. So it kind of fulfilled a lot of the roles that like a modern state would fill, and then also gave you kind of an association of people that you could be connected to. So a little bit like how a church might serve in the modern
yes
as well. Okay, great. So
I wonder
what happened. Oh, go ahead.
So, do any of those churches, do the charters that we have of the armed societies, do any of them mention specifically what churches that they met in? I'm curious just because I want to look to see if there's any, I'm on a quest to see if I can find any existing imagery that actually depicts some of the symbols that they would have used on their coat of arms. And I'm wondering
I'd
if
have
that
to
might be
look up the bylaws again, but from memory, yes, they do specify the church. Yes.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you. It's a rabbit hole I'm going to dive down.
The next one. So, what happened to these armed societies? They sound like they would have been a really useful thing in life, but eventually we know that they disappeared. So, what happened?
Yes, they sort of. They were very prevalent and active in the mid-13th century. Now, Bologna went into pretty steep economic decline in the late 13th century. When I first started researching this, I thought, well, yes, obviously, then you had the Black Death, and that was what ended it all. But no, it pretty much had already vanished by the time of the Black Death. I think it was the economic decline coupled with military decline. Bologna could no longer expand either politically or economically or militarily. Venice cut them off from the Adriatic. And just as the political atmosphere deteriorated, and the popolo grasso became much more controlling. They started excluding people who didn't live in the city itself, but lived in the countryside surrounding the city, were excluded from societies and offices, and they just became much more exclusive. You can also see from the membership rolls of the society that the membership tended to be related to each other to a much larger degree than it had been in the mid-13th century. So I think it's this social exclusiveness that in the end
So they tried
reduced the vitality, and it just melted away. And then, by the early 14th century, you no longer have the Republican Constitution. You have a signoria. So this whole infrastructure of the various committees and councils that form the Republican government of the city itself, not just the societies, but the city itself, no longer function and get taken over by essentially a governor, a prince. Bologna was a papal city, so it was a pope-appointed governor who then took over the government of the city. And because you no longer had these republican institutions, these societies too fell into disuse.
So they
Some remained,
Oh,
like
some
the,
did.
the,
Yeah.
like the societies of the Tuscans and the Lombardy, and the Lombards remained, but they were folks that they had a different basis. They had their membership was essentially foreigners in the city, not Bolognese, but people from outside. And it seemed I think the Lombards, there is talk about the vineyards that the society owned, so it must have been a pretty rich society. And there was a lot of admin to do in that society. So then it would have been even commercially interesting to be member of the society because it was such a rich society.
So their political importance then diminished because power became concentrated into one person, and so there wasn't really necessarily a need to tap into neighborhood power because it became irrelevant. It just became whoever's, how close you are to the head honcho in town, the papal legate.
That was my conclusion as well. Yes.
Okay. But if it had commercial, in the case where they had commercial overlap, then there was still a viable reason for the armed societies to keep going, so they could kind of tap into the commercial contacts.
Yeah, and in the later redactions of the Lombard, the armed part becomes quite irrelevant.
Okay.
No, it does.
Yeah.
And it's much more the commercial side of the business side of the society that features in the bylaws.
So do you think we could say then that as the Republican institutions in Bologna fell apart, the people perceived themselves less as citizens of Bologna and more as like subjects of the local power potentate?
Yeah, I'd see it that way. You're no longer basically, you're no longer a citizen. As you say, you're just a subject. Right? You may still be dragooned for military service, but
it's not your fight anymore.
It's not your fight anymore, exactly. Else. And the fighting also more and more involved mercenaries. Right? So the workers produced the tax income, and the government of the city hired mercenaries.
Okay. So we see in the later Bolognese chronicles that the tribù and the quartiero persisted as a means of organizing civic defense and policing and city militias. Why do you think that these were able to preserve the martial legacy of the armed society?
Yeah, I would speculate, let me put it that way, I would speculate that these, the later organization, even at the time of the armed societies, we have this parallelity between the military organization represented by the armed societies and the military organization represented by the civic government of Bologna.
Right.
The organization of the fighting forces was a matter for the civic organization, for the capitanius and his officers. And what I didn't do, it might be an interesting exercise to check whether any of the society catchment areas overlap these quarter or tribu boundaries, or whether they're all contained within one, especially quarter, one of the four quarters, and not exceed a quarter. So
some of them, I think some of them overlap. There are a few that overlap, but the ones, for example, I think it was the Lombardy, there's a big market in the northern part of town, near the Castello Galleria, and the Galleria Gate, which was the sort of the main northern gate, heading towards Ferrara and Milan and whatnot. And I guess that was the one where, as the sort of the northern exit, there was a big market, and there's probably a lot of traffic coming in from Ferrara. And that one in particular had certain guilds that kind of quartered the market. And there's a little bit of overlap for them. But from the most part, from what I saw, they are kind of generally within the framework of their district.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I would think that
it does deserve a deeper look for sure. That's a really interesting sort of sidebar.
I mean, it might have been meant to be within a district, but then Mario lives just over the line, and they really want to keep Mario and his family in the district, so they add that one street so Mario and all his people can join the society.
Yeah.
Possible. I think in the 13th century, as you have this economic dynamism and the government of the city, to some extent, is struggling to maintain control over this burgeoning populace, and integrating the armed societies into the government structure allows them to exercise a certain amount of control, and it's reciprocal control also. Right? It is republican. The armed societies do elect anziani who then sit in the councils, which are the real governing entity in the town, in the city. So it's not just a top-down exercise. It is sort of reciprocal influence exercise. But I think the city saw a need to find ways of integrating these societies, and at the same time it was a convenient way to do it. I think as later on, as you go to a more authoritarian government, it was just simply not necessary to include these civic societies in the governing structure. Just with the military structure, you had enough control. For your military purposes, you didn't need it, and you didn't want it. You didn't want your control to be dissipated in any way, and because you didn't have to go to a council to get your plans approved. You also didn't have to deal with the societies they represented.
One of the things that I saw when I was looking into this was the title of misura, or master, and you had sort of the masters of the armed societies, you had masters of the guilds, like the craft guilds and merchant guilds and things like that would kind of originally formed and represented each of the districts in the Anziani. Is there any evidence of like a role of how, other than like a sort of a progression system in the way that they might have certified people within these armed societies, or created masters in some sort of a way, or where somebody might have had a higher rank, or was it simply just an election process?
No, it was just an election process, and I never quite figured out the election process. It's it's very convoluted with electing electors and it's clearly designed to prevent anybody turning these armed societies into a personal militia that they could then use. It's as mentioned earlier, the period of office was 6 months, and you couldn't be re-elected for a period, usually about at least 2 years, I think, from memory. So none of these offices in the committee are military, except for the gonfaloniere, the standard bearer.
Right.
And he also has a role. If the societies are in a military setting, if they're in one of Bologna's wars, then on the march, all the members of the society have to stay close to the gonfaloniere. And I think this is to assure discipline on the march, that people care for each other. They make sure that they have enough supplies for themselves. They don't start marauding. They keep together. But it is limited to the march. There is no reference about what is done in battle or anything like that.
Because that's something that would fall to the city authority.
Yes, there are no military officers. There are no small unit structures that you'd say. You have form groups, or you have group leader, platoon leader, and you follow him. No, none of that. The only offices are. There's a treasurer. He's very important because he has to be audited. And there's a lot about the treasurer, but it's all commercial. There's nothing military about it. And then you have the president and vice president, or whatever they're called, and there's no evidence of a military role for any of them.
I wonder if in a military situation, if they would have had a captain chosen from among them, or if they would have had a captain assigned to them by the civic authorities.
Yeah, the bylaws don't say anything. My reading from the extraneous literature was that it would have been the Capitano del Popolo, who would have structured the military units that were actually used for battle.
So in the 15th century, we see with the quarters specifically that there were portions of the population from the districts and the quarters that could be called up by the podesta. So if there was some sort of a civic affair and it required a police force, that the podesta would basically take those from men selected by the gonfaloniere from each district and quarter. Is there any evidence of that starting in the 13th century, or is this something that was just a later sort of development that we see from the quarters and the districts?
Yeah, this is not in these bylaws. There was also an effort during the time of the where these armed societies were active. I think in the second half of the 13th century, they tried to form a society of justice, I think it was called, and to maintain the peace, especially between the burghers and the nobility. But I think that fell apart. It failed. That was an effort at something like a police force. The only element that goes in that direction is, as I said, the provisions that if there is commotion, civic commotion in the city, that the members have to arm themselves, congregate around the gonfaloniere, who has a designated post, and stay there and do nothing. But they are not asked to patrol, but on the contrary, they said, go to the gonfaloniere, stay there and do nothing.
Gotcha.
Okay. This sounds a
'Cause in
little like
12
the National Guard. Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, there was the provision in 1271. I don't know if you came across this in your research, where the Branca, the Griffione, and the Lombardi each got their own special coat of arms, and the assignment of like the peace and the tranquility and punishment of those who disturbed the peace. I was wondering if you had come across anything about that, or what that role kind of looked like for them. For
No,
those three.
sorry, no.
Okay.
That's not something. It could have been something to do with the Lambertazzi, that they helped the town suppress the Lambertazzi.
Suppress,
I don't know.
yeah. Yeah. No, I was just interested because it's on my list of things to dive deeper into and look into, by just kind of looking at some of the Bolognese chronicles to see if I can find a little bit more about what that role entailed and how that kind of looked. And I wasn't sure if you had seen anything.
No, sorry.
So what's up with the butchers? They seem like they are mixed up in everything from 1250 on. Like there's the butchers and then there's everybody else.
Yeah. Again, I didn't look at it from the butcher side. What I did notice is that as I said earlier, there were basically three groups. One was the most of them were these societies defined by certain roads, and then there were the Tuscans, the Florentines, and the Milanese, the Lombards, who had their own society based on where they came from. And then there was only this one other society, the butchers, the Beccai. And it is the only one where there is, let's say, an overlap between a craft guild and an armed society. Interestingly, the version of the bylaws that we have are from the later 13th century, and most of the elements relating to arms are no longer in this set of bylaws. They may have been there and then revised, and we only have a later version. They still call themselves an armed society, but there is nothing about arms in them. So it may be an indication that the armed societies at that point had already lost their military raison d'etre and had devolved into just purely political and social entities.
I did
guilds
see
again would have been separate in parallel. Again, another parallel structure in this city. Sorry?
I did see in my research that there was a drappieri per le armee, where you had a sort of a militant wing of the drappieri, which were the cloth merchants. But I wasn't really sure what their role kind of looked like in terms of whether or not they could still have the same association, where they could have association with the sort of the drappieri that were more of a merchant guild and the sort of the militant wing of that. But one of the things that I think is fascinating about the butchers, like what Stephen kind of proposed with the question, is that we really see the rise of the Bentivoglio family, who eventually did become signore and kind of won the power game of the signore, where, going all the way back to, I think it was 1347, when the Pepoli had really established the first signore in Bologna, and they were kind of doing this sweeping survey of the various guilds. We see the first real mention of the Bentivoglio start to come up with Filippo Bentivoglio as the notary for the armed society of the butchers. And he, and then, like, after that, basically every time there's this uprising in Bologna and the Bentivoglio are involved, the butchers are always there, and they're always either opening a gate for them or taking somebody out for them. they become almost this militant wing of the Bentivoglio. And even after the collapse of the Bentivoglio Signore in the early 16th century in 1506, after Julius II comes to town and basically puts a stop on everything. They show up again later. They hire Carracci to come and paint all these paintings of them doing various acts in Bologna. I think it was in 1570, and it was a way to kind of create PR to kind of repair their image, because they got such a bad image in the city because they were kind of seen as cutthroats. But through that, one of the things that I found in my research was that the butchers actually maintained a military, or not a military, but their own police force, which I thought was really interesting. So even well after the collapse of the sort of the armed societies and sort of the restrictions on the armed societies and stuff like that, and kind of the parsing that out into the quarters, the butchers kept their police force, and basically they would have these special officers that would go around, and if they saw somebody walking down the street with a piece of meat, they would go and they had scales, and they would ask them if they could weigh their meat to make sure that they were charged correctly, to make sure that they either weren't being overcharged or undercharged for whatever they had, which was super interesting. But yeah, the butchers.
I mean, in let's say Swiss and German cities, the guilds were certainly part of the military structure, and in Swiss cities, guilds would be assigned part of the walls to defend, and they would serve as the reservoir of fighters, with also the senior guild administrators, guild masters, also serving as officers for their units. So they were very much integrated into the military structure. Obviously, I wouldn't be surprised if in some parts, in some aspects, that carried over to the guilds. I mean, what I didn't look at would be fascinating to look at is the guilds did exist in the Italian cities even while these armed societies existed, and guilds typically also have the social function of taking care of indigents and stuff like that. And what would be the overlap or the separation of responsibilities between so the social function of the guilds and the social function of the armed societies?
Yeah, one thing that we see all the time, I don't know what, it's hard to say whether or not eventually the guilds, the craft guilds and the merchant guilds in Bologna did take over some semblance of whatever sort of martial legacy was there, similar to what we see in like Northern European cities, where a lot of times the individual training with weapons and things like that were kind of assigned to various guilds or associated with various guilds. Because we do see every time I write about the Bentivoglio, and the Bentivoglio are coming to town and they're going to take over the Piazza Maggiore, they always come in and they're always chanting, "Long live the arts, long live the people,
right.
Long live the arts, long live the people." And this is like a constant theme. And then their rivals, the Canatoli, they'll roll into town, and rather than saying "Long live the arts" like the Bentivoglio would, because the Bentivoglio were often tied to the merchant guilds and very associated with like guild activity and big proponents of the guilds when it came to like a government sort of approach and the way that in their governance they relied heavily on them. Whereas like when the Canatoli come into town, they scream "Carne, carne, carne," and they're out there shouting "Meat,
Meat."
yeah. And it's interesting to see like the various war calls of these different groups, and whether or not that might be some sort of a political if there's something deeper there, just because you do see this with the Bentivoglio always. It's always long live the arts.
Yeah. When they had the revolt in 1507, the cry of the revolters, that is, on the people on the Bentivoglio side, was for liberty, and the cry on the other side was for the church. So I think they were really tied into the self-identity of the Bolognese as a free and independent people.
Yeah. Well, I think that there was there was kind of the economic vein, which I think tended to skew more towards the Scarcese, and then the Maltraversi were a lot of times more geared towards the church. And I don't think those ever really went away, even when it became the Bentivoleschi and, versus the Caneschi and the various factions and things like that. And I almost wonder if the Bentivoglio just kind of were because they were products of the oligarchy, that they were supporting those oligarchs and those big merchants that were kind of had the money and the power to do that. Whereas, for example, when Manziolino has his big revolt in the early, I think it's the 1412, before the 1413 thing that Darty might have been involved in with Ludovico Mariscotti. Manziolino, he, their call is the church comes in and takes power, and then the nobles take the power back from the church. And then the people are we don't want either of you guys. Both of you guys suck at self-governance. So they rise up and they actually form a lower class civic society and basically reform the government and reelect the Anziani and the Sedici from the lower class citizens of Bologna. So the nobles get together with Baldassare Cosa, and they joined hands with the church, and they're all right, maybe we can abide by you and your crazy condottieri / pirate history, and we'll abide by this. And they get the support of Florence, obviously, because the Florentines at this point, Cosimo de' Medici kind of helped ingratiate or help would eventually help Baldassare Cosa become the Pope after this. And so so they join hands and basically just murder all of these lower class citizens that had created this self-government, which is really sad. But that's kind of the origin of the Manziolino family, though, which is super cool because, eventually he goes on and, becomes much more of a Guelph than or much more of a Ghibelline than a Guelph, which is super fascinating.
So one thing I remember from a lecture on guilds in Germany is that the butchers were considered kind of a lower class guild among Germans. Basically, anybody who handled anything animal based was kind of considered sort of nasty and gross. Would the butchers have been sort of outcasts like that in Italian society as well?
I don't really know. I mean, just from my general reading, it doesn't seem to be, because they do seem to have a fairly prominent role, but I couldn't speak to that.
Okay. All right. So what about in other Italian cities? Would societies like these armed societies of Bologna have appeared there as well? Have you run across that?
We know that they did exist in other cities as well, but we have very, very little information on them.
Okay.
I think it is an artifact of Bologna's history that they were so important there, and that the bylaws have survived. And I think this goes back to the freeing of the slaves, that the city authorities basically designated these armed societies as the vehicle for integrating these suddenly appearing unattached individuals, and saying, this is the way we integrate them into our society. And the bylaws, the armed societies were obliged to resubmit their revised bylaws to the city authorities for review and approval. And I think it is that process that assured that, first of all, they were given so much attention, and secondly, that they survived because it was so important at that time.
Okay. So this is kind of my big question whenever I'm looking at Italian history, is we see, especially in Bolognese history, we see in 1250 a very dynamic, very free and democratic state in Bologna for the people there. And about 40 years later, 50 years later, we see it basically devolve into a tyranny of sorts, and becoming more and more anti-democratic, more tyrannical. What lessons do you think a modern society can draw about the devolvement and the devolution of Bologna from a free and dynamic city into a fairly sclerotic and tyrannical state?
Yeah, I think there's two dynamics here. One is the economic decline, which may be linked simply to as they say, the medieval mini ice age setting in. And the second thing is Bologna in the first half of the 13th century was very much on a expansionary track, not just economic expansion but also political expansion. And by the middle of the century, they had basically reached the limit of their political expansions. So they were tied into networks of treaties, of allies, and so once they'd reached the boundaries of their allies, they of course couldn't expand into their ally territory. And on the other hand, they were on the enemy side, they were faced with very powerful enemies like Venice, which was limiting their expansion, and so their swamps in the other direction. So they had reached the limits of their growth, and they didn't deal very well with the changes that implied. And as I said earlier, they didn't come to grips with the political tensions between the burghers and the nobility. And this is not limited to Bologna. This right. is a common theme throughout the North Italian cities. There was always tensions between the burghers and the nobility. And the way Bologna tried to solve the problem is they encouraged their nobility to move outside, to leave the city, to no longer be city resident, so that that the city was a purely burgher city, and the nobility lived outside the city and didn't involve themselves in the politics or the life of the city even.
Okay.
But and then again, militarily, all the cities still relied on the nobility to provide the heavy cavalry.
Right.
The cities were not able to do that. So even in cities that had established firm republican governments, they turned to the nobility for their military leadership and relied on the knightly cavalry that the nobility could provide, and that the burghers simply couldn't. Even if the burghers had the census, they didn't have the skills to do it. But you can't, on one hand, mistreat your military professionals, ask them to perform for the city, but then say politically you're unwanted, stay away until we have another foreign enemy, then we'll rely on you.
Right.
It doesn't work that way. And they made so many enemies that it was very easy for an enemy of the city to bring together at fairly low cost nobility that had a grudge and would willingly participate in your feud against the city. And maybe, you know, if you won, you could take revenge and get back what you lost. So I think in that sense it's really a political failure, and you can see the contrast between this political breakdown in the Italian cities when you compare it to the cities north of the Alps in southern Germany and Switzerland, where they did manage this political transition. Granted, you know, it was a bit easier there, but still, they did manage it. I think one of the curses of the Italian cities was just so much money there, so that it was worthwhile fighting over it. Whereas north of the Alps, there was not enough money. It wasn't worthwhile fighting. You know,
there's no surplus.
It was commercially more interesting to work together. Because the marginal cost of warfare was just so great that it wasn't worth it. Even if you won, you didn't win anything. Whereas in Italy, there was so much money. If you won it, you won a lot.
I almost wonder if like a republican system of the republics would have been. I mean, because if you think about it, like a lot of these cities look more like economically and politically look a lot more like what we see from the modern world as states. And it seems that their big downfall was just not being able to coalesce to ward off kingdoms and empires that decided that they wanted to come into Italy and take a big chunk of that wealth. Because even though like we see it as a failure because of the fact that like really in the 16th century, you know, it had this moment of crisis. It also had this period of height between 1450 into the early 16th century, into the 1500s, where there was tremendous wealth, there's tremendous art, there's tremendous development and ideas, and the industry itself. I think back to Frederick II Barbarossa coming into Italy and going through Bologna and asking if he could take a private tour of the mills that they have there, and they kind of showed him the outside and what they could do, and he was like, "Can I see the insides and how they work?" And they said, "I'm sorry, but we would have to kill you." You know, I mean, because there really was this peak of civilized structure in the way that things were going, and perhaps that was because of the development of these oligarchies and this sort of economic focus of the way that they were doing things, that they were able to accrue such tremendous wealth, because everything was so focused around developing and prospering with their industry versus kind of this allowance of people from the nobility to dictate or sort of coalesce a lot of the power and pull it away from the common man, where you generally see a society that allows the common man to flourish and build and grow.
Yeah, I mean, you had the economic decline in the late 13th century and of course the Black Death, but you know, as you said, the Italian polities of the later 14th and 15th century, they were, you know, principalities. They were essentially dictatorships. But they were not the dictatorships of the traditional nobility. They were dictatorships. In some cases they were, but in many cases they were newly minted dictatorships, like risen from the merchant, from the banking class, or others just having grabbed power. But there was still economy flourished, culture flourished, arts flourished. Even in our modern times, you don't necessarily you can have a developed and rich society without democracy. It's just that it is partly a political commitment to democracy, and also it is a fairly cheap. Democracy is a cheap system to run because you don't have to spend an awful lot on repression. Repression properly done is not,
or corruption. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Repression if properly done is not cheap. The motto of dictators everywhere.
Oh man.
So
That's
so it
hilarious.
goes back to the money. If there's a lot of money around and you can afford the repression, then that's viable. But if there's not enough money around to pay for the repression, then it starts falling apart very quickly. And you can see that a bit in the Swiss cities where there was not a lot of there was no easy source of money, right? There's no silver deposits, no gold deposits. You didn't have the sort of the financial industry. You didn't have the manufacturing, the wool manufacturing. You had fairly sort of, I'd say, middle class value added production.
Right.
And there, you can see it in the political decisions. Repression. They could the ruling classes could not afford the level of repression, and so they sought other more democratic means of persuading the populace to not overthrow them. And I think this goes back. I think in Italy there were just this whole mercenary business that was prevalent in Italian warfare. You need an awful lot of money to pay mercenaries.
Right.
And
that's kind of the irony of Bologna, yeah.
Yeah.
They drive out their knights, so they just end up hiring knights to take over their city.
Yeah.
Oops.
And that's where I'd say if you were asking for lessons for today, I think that is really where we need to look at is that when you start getting into political paranoia, you're in a downward spiral, and
right.
You really have to develop political maturity to live with people who you first of all have nothing in common with, then you probably despise, and in the right circumstances you may even be afraid of, but that's your choice.
You get it. So like you're
find
don't mistake your opponents, your political opponents, for your enemies. Because you and your political opponents are all trying to nurture the same thing, just you want to get a little bit ahead of it, and your enemies want to completely destroy the thing you're depending on trying to grow.
Right. Well, I think that's always been one of the strengths of like the American Republic, for example, has always been our adherence to the freedom of speech and the First Amendment. That being able to have that discussion and people to be able to purport any idea that they want, and leaving it to, calmer minds and to basically tell them in a public forum that that's a really dumb idea, Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, great. I think that's probably all we got. That's fantastic, man. That is a
Jürg, that
fascinating deep dive into the armed societies of Bologna, and From the crazy, expansive Bologna of 1250 to the sad
Decline.
of later, which then
Yeah.
becomes rich once they figure out how to do the cool weaving thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think yeah, it was a pleasure because I've got so many more rabbit holes to run down and investigate. So it was very, very productive. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Enjoyed it. Thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Yeah. And now we have blackmail material against Jack, too. We can call him a LARPer.
Oh,
We
man.
never got that. We never
So
it was forestalled before it ever coagulated.
Yeah, but it was in his heart.
No, he was after the fighting. I think if he would have seen what it was really like, that.
Yeah.
Stephen, I don't know if you've heard this, but both of the Jack and Sam are going to be playing Force of Virtue in an Italian castle with a model of that Italian castle.
Just rubbing it in. Oh,
I know.
I'm close
Well,
to the Italian
so-
castle. Yeah,
No,
screw
no.
you too.
Here's the thing. This is so cool. So, and maybe you can speak to this, Jürg, but I think that they got in with the governor of this city, where this castle's at, and the governor had them basically a diorama and a model built of this castle for them to use to play Force of Virtue and to besiege this castle. And so what they're doing is in this castle, they're going to have the diorama. And if you ever want to come and play Force of Virtue, you can just visit that castle and then go play the game. It's the coolest thing I've ever heard in my entire life.
Where is the
Yeah.
castle?
This is Gradara. There was a siege in Gradara, 1446, something like that, mid 15th century.
The Malatesta.
Between
Evil Head.
and Sforza. And the castle, the model is finished. It is on the scale for the 28 millimeter figures, like the Perrys, and it was first presented at Salute. There's the gaming convention in London. I think 10 days ago now. And both Jack and Sam were there. Now, the Force of Virtue is a sort of skirmish, a medieval skirmish game, late medieval, early Renaissance skirmish game. And they had developed rule set for infantry skirmish. Now, for Gradara, for this castle, they also had to develop rule sets for siege artillery and cavalry. So these are now there, and there's it's worth. I mean, it's fascinating to go to the websites. There's a website for the castle itself, made by Oshiro in the UK. It's now going to the gaming convention in San Marino, where it is next week. Then at the end of May, I think 18th, 19th, 20th of May, it is in... I was going to say, no, it's south of Ferrara. Again, another town there in Italy. And then in June, it is finally going to go to its home in Gradara, where in the castle, as Joshua was saying, there is a room where this castle will be set up, and you can rent it. And...
yeah.
Play.
Well, one day we're going to have to do a real deep dive on Padua and see if we can get them to make a campaign version of the game to cover all the different little battles going around the siege of Padua in 1509.
Jack did say...
Modena. They're in Modena. That's where they are.
Modena.
Okay, yeah,
cool.
awesome.
Yeah.
So Jack did say that after they had come up with how they were going to do siege tactics, he was going to look at the siege of Padua. So Yeah, because we know what happens, right? I mean, all you have to do is just create
orders
a
of
model.
battle. Like we can
We do,
tell you
yeah.
who
We know
commanded
exactly where the fighting was
which
happening.
guys at which gate. Yeah, it's fantastic. The Venetians like literally just have lists of the numbers of guys in each.
It's amazing the records you have for this sort of thing, and I did not. I deliberately did not get involved in the tabletop gaming for various reasons. One key reason was that I just saw that this is something, if I start getting involved, it'll take up far more of my time than I have.
Yeah, that's kind of where I'm at too. It sounds so cool, but I've already got like 0 time. So
Yeah.
yeah.
So, but yeah, it's the rule set allows you. Obviously, there is still an element of chance, but by judicious combination of different elements, you can minimize chance and succeed, even if the luck is slightly against you.
Great.
And yeah, the objective was to reproduce in gameplay scenes that you could see in the literature of the time. If you read Pietro Monte,
Well, that's kind of what I want to see with all these bolognese. Like, oh, it'd be cool if there's a board game that captures like all the the intricacies of this like political, like infighting and stuff like that, and then like play the board game to like really kind of feel it and understand it. Go
Yeah.
Witchers.
Oh, well,
Yeah.
thank you, Jürg. That was
Thanks so
awesome.
much, Jürg. It was great having you on.
excellent. Okay,
All right.
Bye, guys.
Take care.
Bye.
bye.